Are you ready, kids?
Hello, it's Employee a Million, and welcome back to SpongeComs. Today's episode is Season 4, Episode 11, or Episode 71 overall, Whale of a Birthday and Karate Island, both of which originally premiered on Nickelodeon on May 12th, 2006. As always, this thumbnail part of the video is the intro, and when we cut into the dedicated Whale of a Birthday card, that's when that starts. I always have to try and find a way to pad things out for these 45 seconds that the intro would play for the commentary track, and there we go. Now we hard cut into the title card and hard cut out of it rather than fade in and fade out, and I don't know why that became the norm from this point forward. Just fading in and out is such a picky thing to be nostalgic about, so it is just something to notice, and some episodes still do that until season 5, but it is something that has changed, and it's a very picky thing to talk about anyway. This episode is written by Luke Brookshire, Tom King, and Paul Tibbitt, and it is a Paul Tibbitt episode, so there is this understanding of the characters, but I don't think it's to the best extent in Whale of a Birthday. Like, something innovative about this episode is that it's the first time, to my knowledge, that a major SpongeBob character is given an age. In this particular episode, Pearl turns 16. And I don't know why they picked a specific age for her. They could have just kept her a teenager. Would have made the whole continuity a bit less muddy, but it's not the biggest deal. SpongeBob technically starts the show as a 12-year-old, so ages aren't really that important. But what is important is what she likes in this episode, which is a band called Boys Who Cry, which is a parody of these sort of sappy 90s boy bands like Boyz II Men, Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, that were all the rage when SpongeBob started in 1999. But by 2006, boy bands had gone out of style again, and they haven't really come back since. I choose to believe One Direction is a glitch in the timeline. So this does feel like something that would have happened in season 1 or 2 if they were, always racing to catch up to the times, which I'm glad the pre-movie era didn't really do. That gives off the illusion that this sort of boy band would have fit at home earlier in the show. But I really do think that it is the mostly 40s, 50s writers making fun of these sort of boy bands that they think are very shallow and manipulative, when their generation, their interest in boy bands starts and ends with early Beatles stuff. They're probably more into alt rock, and I mean, I like that sort of stuff. I like boy bands. I just like any music I can tap my foot to. I don't really consider it too, on the nose, but it is the most fun part of the episode because the rest of this episode isn't very fun at all. You've got this whole conflict of Pearl wanting the best birthday ever. She's got this song stuck in her head about wanting the whole world to pay attention to her, and it's all about her. But Mr. Krabs isn't accommodating. He's never been accommodating for her birthdays. And they really amp up Mr. Krabs' borderline neglect of Pearl's feelings. Not necessarily of her needs, but her feelings. I think that's the important difference. I don't think that what he does here is too horrible. But again, it does sort of feel like an exaggeration of what he would have done earlier, rather than, feeling like an authentic conflict that these characters would have. It feels like an exaggeration of what Mr. Krabs would do, like not even know what gender Pearl is when he adopts her, or has her, or whatever their backstory is. That whole "it's a boy" banner thing raises more questions than answers, and I'm not gonna bother answering any of them. But what really makes this episode pretty flawed, and an episode that I like less with time, despite Boys Who Cry, is that the ending almost seems to promote materialism. And I want to make it very clear that it's a happy ending for Pearl, but what about this episode gives Pearl a story arc rather than she wants a good birthday, she gets a bad birthday, and then she gets a good birthday? Because Pearl may be one of the more shallow characters on the show, but she gets story arcs, like the chaperone. What does she learn there? She learns, well, she starts out not wanting to go to the prom with SpongeBob, but learns that going to the prom with SpongeBob made it more fun. Bossy Boots. What did she learn? She starts off sort of tricking everyone into thinking that she wants to work at the Krusty Krab, but is making it worse. But then she learns that this is wrong, that this is hurting SpongeBob, and they come to a deal. If this is a Pearl episode, what is she learning here? What is Mr. Krabs learning here? Mr. Krabs does have the closest thing to a character arc in this, as he does sort of pay the price, literally, for not giving Pearl the best birthday at the Krusty Krab. But that is a bit of a stretch. They actually cut a line in a lot of copies of this episode at the very end when SpongeBob says that he's given Pearl a good birthday. Krabs says, "Don't push your luck, boy." And that is cut out because it's after a fade to black, and sometimes in later copies, those sorts of lines are cut out. We've got an interesting pairing here in that both have endings that are edited in at least the copy that I'm using to do this SpongeComs for. Oh, and also the whole statue thing of patty meat. I do like that bit because it is a recycling of a gag that they had for Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 2. Instead of making those statues out of patties, they were originally made out of patty meat, but I don't know if it came off too gross or anything, but I think making them out of patties was funnier, so, you know, it's just a little fun fact thing that makes this a bit better. Not much better is that it makes absolutely zero sense that Squidward would like boy bands like Boys Who Cry. If it was this sort of guilty pleasure and he sort of had to hide it from Mr. Krabs for a second or two, that would make more sense for his character, but I really don't know why they made him into boy bands for this one episode. He likes clarinet. Later in the season, we're introduced to Kelpie G. That's the sort of music that a curmudgeon like Squidward would find escapism in, not singing about 16th birthdays and foreplay. But the silver lining to that is that it is funny that Squidward would know this, even if it just... I think it would have been funnier if Mr. Krabs forced him to perform. It wouldn't be the funniest thing in the world, but it would provide some, you know, logic to this. I think what also really holds this episode down is that Pearl's friends are total jerks. I mean, on one hand, at least the word coral is back in style, but these friends, well, we know from the chaperone that Pearl doesn't always get along with her friends if she starts to look dorky to them, but here, their only role is to promote the materialistic ending that, you know, if Pearl has a rubbish birthday party, then her friends aren't going to like her. But if she gets all these presents, then bada bing, they like her. It's just a bit shallow, and I get that sometimes teenagers can be shallow, but it doesn't really feel like they're coherent characters. They just feel like props for the story to have such a sweet ending. And even, like, some of the jokes aren't the best. I do like a lot of the SpongeBob gags at the mall, where, you know, he has to fake Mr. Krabs' name just to use his credit card. I think that's a good bit. and some of the ways that he gets presents for Pearl. In fact, I think that this episode would be a lot more powerful if, instead of this promoting these sorts of extremes of a rubbish birthday party and just this very excessive birthday party, SpongeBob got Mr. Krabs to give Pearl one incredible present rather than just a lot of junk that Pearl is probably going to use up in a day, including the sea pony. Okay, two major problems with that joke is that, for one, it's very violent for no reason with the fantasy the sea pony has. Two, what kind of mall sells the equivalent of horses? I know some malls have pet stores, a few very high-end ones, but that's just a foreign concept to me as a New Zealander, where we have a couple malls and they're not that big compared to what you guys have in the States. If that's reality in Bikini Bottom, so be it, but yeah, I feel like this episode fails a lot of spot checks, even if it is a vibes episode. It is designed to make you feel good for Pearl and SpongeBob, and somehow Boys Who Cry were totally okay with being put in a box. It's an episode that exists for a happy ending, but I think everything before that doesn't exactly land. I think the opposite can be said for Karate Island, where, okay, we need to address the controversy with this episode. Written by Casey Alexander, Chris Mitchell, and Stephen Banks. Nothing against any of them. They've made better episodes. Karate Island, for some reason, was the episode that won the Best Day Ever contest for the Best Day Ever marathon. I'll talk more about that in SpongeComs 80, but for one thing, nearly everything in the top 20 was season 4 episodes, and this, for some reason, was the episode that got number 1. And there are many technical reasons for why I think this episode was so popular, at least in 2006. For one, recency bias. People are always drawn to the newest thing, and even though there was some criticism of season 4 at the time, just as much as today, maybe even more at the time, kids were very excited that they were getting more SpongeBob episodes, and this episode was the newest to have its own DVD, which released in July, and this whole contest thing was in October, so they must have had that on their minds. And another big thing is Avatar: The Last Airbender getting released and just getting very popular. I think around Karate Island, it would have been in book 2, which, in my opinion, is one of the best seasons of television ever. It was just getting very exciting to see what happened next. And you've got SpongeBob, the other most popular Nicktoon of around the time, unless you count the Fairly Odd Parents, having an episode about SpongeBob and Sandy doing these martial arts things, and martial arts, or at least a variant of it, is very prominent, integral to Avatar, and I think just some dots connected there in terms of appeal and demographics. And it also promised to be a build-up from past karate episodes, but nothing karate really happens until the very end. It is justified by the narrative that Karate Island would be so bad at knowing what karate is. You've got these big thugs that SpongeBob takes down by doing nothing, but then you've also got these sort of villains that Sandy goes up against, and they aren't karate people, and Sandy doesn't thwart them with karate techniques. But then we learned that it was all a timeshare scam, and then the dots connect. Oh, they're just using karate as like a motif to sell this land. But I'll talk more about the timeshare thing at the end, because it is a very strange plot twist, but I really like it. It sort of justifies why some things about this episode are so strange, because I think in general Karate Island is supposed to give off this very strange feeling. And I do like SpongeBob and Sandy's dynamic in this, even if it is very undercooked. Like, I don't think it's that out of character at all for SpongeBob to get a very big head about people telling him that he's the best and letting something get to his head, because we've had squirrel jokes. We've had, as seen on TV, for SpongeBob to go through this and learn his lesson, but here it's for karate, and it's something that, for once, people are telling him that he's even better than Sandy at. And there are times where they've been able to equal each other, but for the most part, Sandy always kicks SpongeBob's butt at that. So there is a reason for him to be like this. I think that it is sort of an endearing thing for SpongeBob to think that he's the best at something like this. I don't think that it's too wildly out of character, even if it is kind of annoying. And even if you do think that it is annoying, at least it's only for 3 minutes at most, because that's the amount of time that he and Sandy interact. I feel like this could have been a half-hour episode, because then we'd have more of a reason for Sandy to want to leave SpongeBob and let him just, see what happens. Because this feels like a big second act breakup, but we're only halfway through an 11-minute cartoon, and yeah, it is very quick when you think about, how much time you spend with SpongeBob characters usually. Another odd thing about this episode is that it randomly references pop culture. Not in the way you'd think, with Pat Morita being the voice of Master Udon, but in terms of having Sandy dress in a yellow jumpsuit, like the sort of yellow suit that Kill Bill wears in Kill Bill Volume 1, as well as Kill Bill Volume 2. I don't know why they're randomly referencing Tarantino movies, but, it's Karate Island. I'll just let it slide, because it's this very strange, mystical episode. And here's the thing, I will defend aspects of Karate Island, not the whole thing, because I do feel like this episode gets a bad rep. Like, there was a huge backlash to this episode getting the #1 spot in the Best Day Ever Marathon for a little while there, but in most videos about the marathon that I've seen since, and most, retrospectives on it, most of the people talking about it are like, it's very flawed, it's nowhere near the best episode, but at least it's not the worst. And I think, a very average reception, evening out after all this time, is warranted, because I can't really see that many people who, love the pre-movie era to death getting much out of this episode, because SpongeBob is very childish at the start. You've got these very childish ideas in the middle of these very weird foes, and it doesn't seem like it's living up to its premise, even though the premise is just the backdrop for this whole timeshare scam. The part of the episode I really don't like is the random gross-out guy who's like the third rival that Sandy has to face. And even then, I can kind of see why they wanted to have this very strange fellow who does something that no land creature probably does, except maybe skunks and stuff, of just being the sort of thing that you can't see on land, because this might be based on some sort of sea creature, And that is, hey, don't worry, Steve, we're still living up to some of the marine biology origins of the show. We've got stinky fish. That's why I'm not necessarily hating this, but sort of, it's hard to tolerate, but then we get to the big climax, and then the big karate stuff happens. Master Udon reveals his true colors, and I feel like this whole thing about Master Udon really, after all this time, being some sort of timeshare salesman is their attempt at, pivoting back to an adult audience, because as we all know, even back in the day, SpongeBob was very popular with adults for things that make Rocko's Modern Life so popular. The relatability of making this children's cartoon with themes that an adult would get. So I see why they wanted to randomly pivot into him actually being a supervillain in, a monetary sense. But then this is sort of dropped after a few seconds, as they have to go back to the action to make everyone happy that you've got some level of karate in here, some level of martial arts stuff. We have Sandy just sort of breaking herself out, and SpongeBob just sort of leaving his chair. I think maybe a scene of SpongeBob's cuffs getting unleashed was cut because there's no explanation for how he leaves the chair. Just like how there's no explanation at the beginning of how Norton the Mailman is just inside SpongeBob's house rather than at his door. I don't get it, but maybe I'm not supposed to get it. The timeshare stuff does come back at the very, very end because you've got that funny joke of it rebranding itself as Clarinet Island and Squidward being, roped into this whole scheme. And, that's a better way to end things off, to make the theme of the episode clearer. But, yeah, I can see why some people would consider this one of the weaker episodes from this time. I think that it's very exciting. It's a decent Sandy episode from start to finish, which is really all I want sometimes. And for a little while after it premiered, it was dedicated to Pat Morita, who, voiced Master Udon. He died about 6 months before this episode premiered, so I can see why they wanted to pay tribute to him immediately, or nearly immediately, after he, left us. But it is cut in most copies of the episode today, so there's no real reason to, dwell on it. He delivered a good performance for this episode, and that's where I want to leave it. So that was Whale of a Birthday and Karate Island, a very mixed pair of episodes in my view. My question time for you last week was, what's your favourite Sandy episode? And I got a lot of answers, a lot more than I posited, and a lot more than I remembered. Dashiell really liked Karate Choppers and Pre-Hibernation Week. Snake Man, Survival of the Idiots. Brendan Barney, Karate Choppers. Random Lad, Squirrel Jokes. I Had an Accident, Pressure and Shopping List. I've never really thought of I Had an Accident as a Sandy episode, but I can see it. Bryce Vaughan, Karate Choppers, I Had an Accident, and Sandy's Nightmare. Foxboy, Feral Friends, Mooncation, I Had an Accident, Pre-Hibernation Week, Perfect Chemistry, and Goons on the Moon. A lot of post-movie and post-sequel stuff, I like to see that, and Mooncation, I'd forgotten about Mooncation, that is a great one, good pick. And Sparkling with Nights, Texas, I Had an Accident, and Sandy's Nightmare. I'm interested to see what people love about Sandy's Nightmare. I just think it's good but not great, but maybe on SpongeComs 200 and something I'll understand. Question time for you now is, what's your favorite birthday episode? I don't think Whale of a Birthday is going to be that many people's picks because you've technically got SpongeBob Meets the Strangler. That's a classic. My vote would probably be Feral Friends. I think that is a very top-tier post-sequel SpongeBob episode, and it keeps the motif of Sandy, the birthday girl, being the main character throughout, so it's got a lot of strong impetus for being, a lot of people's picks, but we'll see how it goes. In 3 weeks, wish me well for all that glitters, and we'll see what glitters about wishing you well. Goodbye for now.